Hafa day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arlene Steffi. We're back with Season 4 of iTinaotao Marianas. We have covered the history of the Marianas from 1521, the discovery of Magellan, to 1898 with the Spanish-American War. We are going to go backwards a little bit in time in the sense that this season we will be talking about the archaeology of the Marianas and also of Micronesia, and how archaeology can help us to understand ourselves. Now, you're probably wondering, why is that important? What is important about this is that not only do we have the narratives that have been written about who we are and who came here and what they discovered and all the expeditions that came through here, but also people who have dedicated themselves, their professional and personal lives, to the understanding of what artifacts are beneath the ground. These artifacts tell us another story about who we are. And so Season 4 will cover the archaeology of the Marianas and of Micronesia.
It really began when I was a graduate student in UCLA. I became very much interested in fishing as a way of life, and I realized very quickly that, island life would be a good place to start, because a lot of people who live on islands live on fish and coconuts and a few other things. And I was working at the Field Museum in Chicago as an assistant oceanic curator at that time, and teaching part-time at the University of Chicago. And I wrote a proposal up to the National Science Foundation that I selected Guam because I had a wife and 3 children, and I wanted someplace that I thought, that they would be able to go, kids would be able to go to school and things of that kind, rather than picking a place that probably was a little less developed at that particular time. Anyway, the grant was approved. I got a nice letter from the Bishop Museum saying that they thought this was a great idea. Someone should go to work in the Micronesian area of Oceania, and Guam would be a good start. So to make a long story short, I wound up in Inarajan and lived across the street from, I guess, Commissioner Diego, the San Nicolas Diego family down there, and the Leon Guerreros lived in the house behind the place. I guess it used to be the old medical center. That was the concrete building right in the center of Inarajan. The Perez family and all these families were around, the Chargalovs and things of that kind. So I had brought with me an assistant, Peter Newcomer, and I don't know what he's doing now. And we arranged for him to stay. I'm not sure where he stayed. Someone had an empty room or an empty house that they put Peter up in, and my family was in the bottom. And my kids, 2 girls and a boy, they all went to school there for a couple of years. So that's one of the things that came there. Well, as soon as I got there and began to look around, I realized that a lot of stuff hadn't been surveyed, and so instead of beginning to excavate sites immediately, because I was looking for time depth and worried about things that had to do with how fishing was important in the lifestyle and form and how people kept alive, raising food and things of that kind. So my first half of my time there was spent just surveying the island, around the peripheries of the island and some of the inland river valleys, around the Talafofo and places like that. When I first got there, of course, people thinking I was a tax collector for the government were very suspicious of my motives. Why was I going to village meetings and saying, I want to have permission to look at your lands? And it was kind of suspicious. Well, this went on for several weeks. I managed to go to a few places. But finally, some little kid, I was sitting out in front of my place one night drinking a beer, and some little kid came up to me and said, you asked me what I was doing. He said, oh, you're kind of like a scientist. And I said, yeah, kind of. The next thing I knew, I was getting permission to go just about anywhere I wanted. They realized that I was here independently. So anyway, after that, I began a rather systematic survey all around the peripheries of the island. And we went all around the island surveying land. And everybody was very happy to give me permission once they realized that I wasn't going to tell the government how much land they had or how many chicken coops were down in the boonies and things of that kind. And it was very fruitful. I found a lot of sites, which you can see in my report. And I also, because I lived in Inarajan, I knew quite a few of the people in there, and so people like the San Nicolases and the Perez's and stuff gave me permission to look at properties that, ordinarily, I guess you wouldn't get a chance. So I got up into the hills and the mountains and things of that kind, and walked all across a lot of the southern part of the island, much more so than the north part.
I cannot say enough about David Tuggle. He and I have become very, very close over the years, working together and working apart. But we became familiar with each other when we met in Tinian while he was doing a project and so was I. I went down for supper one evening and he was there, and man of very few words, but it began a long-term friendship. David has become our editor for traditional fishing practices, which we hope to see this year.
My full name is Harold David Tuggle. My parents decided to call me by my middle name, which has caused innumerable problems over the years, especially after 9/11, where everybody has to have a full name. But I go by Dave. I go by Dave. I was born in Lexington, Kentucky, 1941, just before Pearl Harbor. When I was a kid, my parents took me out west on a trip, and I fell in love with the West, and I went to graduate school in Arizona as a result of that. And so I've lived most of my life actually in Arizona, with approximately 14 years in Hawaii after that. But I consider myself an Arizonan now. I grew up during segregation, and that left such a bad taste in my mouth that I have no interest in my home state. So I'm quite happy to consider myself an Arizonan now, or a Southwesterner. But I went to the University of Arizona, and my first teaching job was in New York State. But after I got my PhD in Arizona, I was able to get a job teaching at the University of Hawaii. So I taught there for 9 years. And after that, I spent 3 years working for the Navy as the archaeologist in the Pacific. It was that job with the Navy, my responsibility as their archaeologist. I was their first archaeologist to come on board at the what was called NAVFAC. The National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966, and it is, in my mind, I'm not a historian of federal legislation, but in my mind, it's one of the most interesting acts ever passed, because it is an act that recognizes the role and the responsibility of the federal government to the local community. And that responsibility is a concern for the historic properties on federal lands or affected by federal actions. But the point of the act was, and this is the point that I emphasize as being so important, was that it recognized that the federal agency and its property and its lands and its actions were in a local environment. The law recognizes that the local culture, whether it's a state culture or a tribal culture or whatever the case may be, that the local community has a long-term interest in its own history, its own historic preservation, and that the federal government has to share its responsibility for the oversight of those historic properties with the local community.
My name is Hiro Kurashina. I was trained at the University of California, Berkeley. I received all my degrees, PhD, MA, and bachelor's degree. And during the graduate studies, I worked in Israel, Africa, in the Hada region of Africa, where early hominid remains have been unearthed. And after doing that, of course, I had to look for a job. And I was appointed to be an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in Canada for 1 year. And then I was recalled back to Berkeley to do more research on paleoanthropology pertaining to the early hominids of East Africa regarding the human origins. So I've been always interested in the origins of people. Back in 1979, of course, I was doing research at Berkeley and quite busy, but I got this phone call from Dr. Bruce Caroli, who was then the chairman of the Geography Anthropology or Anthropology Geography Department at the University of Guam. And I said to Dr. Caroli, could you explain to me what Guam is like, or the University of Guam is like? And he said, I still remember to this day, he said, well, think of Guam as a suburb of San Diego, like La Jolla. And I had never been to Guam before, and so I called my brother. My younger brother had been to Guam before. And my younger brother says, well, you know, Guam, he's been to Saipan and Guam before, and it's a paradise. You should take the offer. So I called the University of Guam. I talked to Dr. Bruce Caroli and happily accepted the offer. And on January 13th, 1980, I arrived on a Pan American flight from San Francisco. And I think it was like 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. And what really impressed me was all the people from the department, plus the Territorial Archaeology Lab, were at the airport so early in the morning. And they whisked me to King's restaurant for breakfast. So that was the beginning. And one of the things they encouraged me to do was to get out to the field to do an archaeological project. So I had a few options. And I decided to do a project, a long-term project at Teragi Beach at the northern end of Guam. And in order to do that, I needed a grant. So I applied for a research grant to the National Geographic Society. And soon they replied favorably, and I received a grant from the National Geographic Society. And I was able to train somewhere around 300 to 400 students over a period of 5 years, from 1980 to 1984. And I had obtained so much archaeological information that was quite fascinating to me and fascinating to the students. And of course, it was in the best interest of the general public.
And now you'll hear from Darlene Moore and Roz Hunter Anderson, the women from Mars.
I worked at a site in Teragi, and the Teragi site was under Dr. Hiro Kurashina. And the Teragi site had a really deep stratigraphy. So my thesis was to analyze the pottery from the site. So to do that, I had to review all the previous work that had been done. And that involved reading Fred Reinman's work and his analysis of the pottery that he recovered during his archaeological survey of Guam that was done in 1965-66. Now, when I was working, it was 1981, 82, and 83, so that was like almost 20 years later. And when he analyzed the pottery, he looked at the temper inclusions, and he based the analysis on volcanic temper, which was mostly Latte period, and calcareous temper, which is the earlier. And then even before him, Alexander Spohr had analyzed pottery, and he talked about the red ware and the plain ware. And the red ware had a red slip or red wash on it, and that more or less corresponded with what Fred Ryman called calcareous ware. And then the plain ware was, it didn't have a red slip, so that more or less corresponded with what Reinman was calling the Latte period. So the names are all sort of mixed up, and rather than trying to segregate the pottery sherds into pottery types, in other words, volcanic, sand temper, or redware, they had me look at different characteristics of the pottery. So then I was looking at the temper and the thickness and the surface treatment and making a table or so forth of when things changed, and correlating that with radiocarbon dates from Teragi Beach, the Teragi Beach site. So after looking at thousands of pottery sherds, I wrote that all up in my thesis, and that's how I got the experience I needed. And then, just because of that background, as we formed our own business, then I was the one who analyzed the pottery, and that's my story.
And the business is named what?
Our business was Micronesian Archaeological Research Services, and we were founded in 1992 and are just about through with our long stint of working on archaeological sites.
What do you mean just about through?
Well, some of us have already retired, and some of us are about to retire, I think. Yeah, so since in the mid-1980s is when I first started working. And when I first started analyzing the pottery, it wasn't known for certain whether people actually cooked food in the pottery or used it some other way, like for storage. In fact, there was an article written in 1986 about foodways on Guam, and it wasn't certain then whether people were cooking in pottery. Well, they definitely did cook in pottery. And in recent years, we've analyzed the charred remains on the pottery sherds, not locally, but we send the sherds off island to people who have that expertise. And they have identified some of the plant remains that remain in that charred residue. And those residue analyses have indicated that people were cooking taro corms, and yams. And we haven't found breadfruit starch yet, but we know at least in the Latte period they were cooking breadfruit, and in the Latte period they were cooking rice in the pots. So the Latte period pottery, which has volcanic sand temper and does not have a red surface, makes a very good pot for boiling foods and storing rice grains and storing water resources if you need to have water. While the earlier pots, which are flat-bottomed pans and sort of open, they didn't make good pots for cooking rice and so, you know, they probably didn't have rice then, so they didn't need a pot for cooking rice. It was only once they got rice that they developed a pot for cooking rice.
Well, I'm an old hand in Micronesia by now. I started my career after the doctorate in 1980 in, of all places, the remote islands of Yap in Micronesia, Western Micronesia. And that was a wonderful opportunity to be an archaeologist in a location where the indigenous culture is still very vibrant and connected to its past, its recent past at any rate. So that was a really a wonderful way to learn about Micronesia from the perspective of the western side of the region. And after 2 years in Yap, I went back to Albuquerque where I had gotten my doctorate, spent a year writing up my materials, and then came back out to Guam to the university and had a one-year appointment there. When I was at the university in this one-year position in 1984, it was running out. The time was running out, and I thought, I like it here. I want to learn some more. So I started to write grant proposals through the Water and Energy Research Institute at the university. That's what it was called then. And these were to the federal program called the Water Resources Study. It's a grant every year that the university receives to forward work in water research. So I brought the anthropological angle into my proposals, and the U.S. Geological Survey is the unit that gives this money. They agreed that I should go out on these projects and study the traditional freshwater customs of the islanders. And this got me out to Chuuk, out to the Mortlocks, out into Pohnpei and Koshrai, and main islands of Chuuk, and even back into Yap. So I did, and I went to Namaluk in the Mortlocks. That was the Mortlocks. Anyway, I did these studies, and then of course there were technical reports on my findings. And I think these are a little obscure, and I think I really do need to get those out into a wider publication venue. But so that again was, that was a very basic education in anthropology, not so much archaeology, but the customs around water and its conservation. And I did do a kind of a compilation article which incorporated some of that information in a context of understanding the differences between the agricultural systems in the eastern part of Micronesia and the western part. And the first thing that struck me about the differences was the rainfall differences. You've got, on the west, you've got drought, you have the El Nino effects, which are much more severe on the western side of Micronesia. They have a seasonality anyway, and then when Nino comes, it's even more exaggerated. So we have a conservation ethic, much more pronounced in the Western Islands cultural systems than you do in the east, in Pohnpei and Koshrai, where the rainfall is so abundant. It's like a joke, conserve? Why, right? So, but it was just really, it was quite striking. And so that was kind of the basis of this article about the differences in the agriculture, because it has implications. In the east side, it's mostly trees, it's the breadfruit, it's the water-loving plants. In the west, it's the yams, the storage type of crops, where it's yams and that Certosperma taro, which is kind of almost wild, but not quite. I mean, it is cultivated, but it can stand drought. It's like the taro that's in the taro patch can stay for, like in the bank, like money in the bank, and it's growing. Every year it's growing. Even though there may be a drought, there may be some excessive rainfall, that taro keeps on growing and growing and getting bigger, and that's their security, that's their insurance. So these were quite striking differences, and that's the point that I made in that article. Wary is dedicated, or was at that time dedicated to managing water, solving water problems in the islands. And it was, Wary had the grant every year to do more technical studies, like how much water is really in Guam's aquifer, things like that. So they had computer modeling and so forth like that. So when I came in with anthropology, it was one of the first. It was not the first, but it was one of the first fieldwork-oriented anthropological projects. And of course, when I was out there, I was interested in the archaeology as well, but I didn't do any digging. Okay, but I was observing. Yeah. So that's, so Wary was, I would say, it was a little bit unusual, but they were quite tolerant, and I really did enjoy that association. And then I got the Guam perspective. I started to pay attention to the Guam archaeology. And ultimately, that's where I ended up living, was in Guam for almost 20 years. And working with my colleagues at the Micronesian Archaeological Research Services.
I don't know if enthusiasm is what drives Mike Carson, because I really think that Mike Carson is passionate about his work. Not to say that the others aren't passionate, but Mike is very aggressive, very determined, and very focused on discovery. He knows there's something there, and he wants to find it, and he pushes the borders. For example, Reinman did the coastal survey, so Mike is not necessarily finding things that Reinman didn't. However, what Fred did was document the sites, the numbers, the types, and the locations. But Mike is going back into those locations, and Mike is doing a thorough job at what really is at those sites. And so that's why Mike is the one that is now, Mike is the now archaeologist.
First site I worked on Guam, I first came here right after Super Typhoon, I forget the name, I think it was Paka. I came a few weeks after that, and that was in January of '98. I believe that's right. Yes, January of '98. And my project was in Agate, working for installing water and sewer lines in Agate, right near the Subway restaurant that's in Agate. At that time, I came to Retidian as well and saw all the damage from the fallen trees and everything, and I knew right away this was the place to do archaeological research because it's so big and open and preserved. And at that time, Hiro Kurashina and his colleagues had done a study here only in a very small footprint where they were allowed to work. This is, they did their work in 1990 when the Navy station was being shut down. They were allowed to work only in the footprint of that Navy base, and everything else was top secret, you know. So they did some studies that were very encouraging about what could be done at Retidian. And since then, I've followed up on it. And so starting in about 2005, I had more opportunities to work in Saipan and in Guam, and followed every opportunity I could, and then just moved permanently to Guam and had a relationship with the University of Guam, and especially the Micronesian Area Research Center. I still do. I still affiliated and work with students and projects constantly. And I'm out here today at Retidian with some students from University of Guam, in fact, and showing them what the place is and some of the research potential that is here. We've had a few master's thesis and undergraduate honors theses done at Retidian, which is fantastic. People going on to other countries internationally to get their PhDs studying Marianas archaeology, which makes me feel like I've finally accomplished something in my life. And to really look for, it's a very exciting time for archaeology in the Mariana Islands, that there's such a strong feeling of what archaeology can mean for Chamorro people, as well as archaeologists just interested in the Marianas and what the Marianas mean for the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. There's so much to do here.